Hello, Marc. It's very good to see you.
Hello, Michael. Good to see you again, indeed.
Um, we're talking about ancient Near Eastern empires and their collapse in the late Bronze Age today. I'm just wondering, how was it like to live in an ancient Near Eastern empire, say the Assyrian Empire or the Hittite Empire?
Yeah, it's like, it's an interesting question. Indeed, how would a individual, let's say, a farmer living somewhere in a territory that becomes integrated into one of these great empires of the ancient Near East that we study and that we all know, like the Assyrian Empire, how would that person and his family members have felt being now part of that empire? I would imagine that actually for many of the people, for the majority of the population, daily life would not have changed that much after the conquest phase, of course. This in the information that we have in the documentation that we have, especially since you mentioned the Assyrian Empire, warfare is emphasized enormously. So empires in the first millennium before Christ were built through military means, and of course we all know that military means can include an enormous amount of destruction, enormous amount of violence. Is that entirely true? It's not necessarily entirely true. It is very well possible that large territories were annexed by these empires like the Assyrian Empire with very little warfare, with very little conquest involved. But let's say there is a part of the Assyrian Empire that is conquered through military means. Let's say the west of Syria, for example, where we do have documentation uh, that is took place. So let's say that after several years or certainly several months of military activity, a certain region becomes integrated within the empire. I would actually imagine that for the people who live there, farmers, take farmers as an example, this might be, a situation of rest. Previously, they may have been called up for military duty in order to, defend the territory, the kingdom to which they belong against the empire. Now they are, let's hope, in good health, settled back in their farms and so on, if they are not, as a consequence of the conquest, deported towards another part of the empire and so on. But let's say the empire could, you can imagine that it does also produce an amount of peace, tranquility, order in these regions. And we should, so obviously, nobody wants to be subject to an imperial power, I imagine. Obviously, empires treat subjects sometimes in very unpleasant ways, very exploitative ways. Um, in the end, once you become part of this larger system, I can imagine that in certain areas, certain decades, uh, people actually obtained a degree of comfort and a degree of order that they previously did not have.
So empires are machines that produce stability to a degree.
To a
Um,
degree, it's
the empires of the late Bronze Age. So if we look at
yeah,
the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, but also the in Mesopotamia, the Middle Assyrian Empire, they looked pretty much invincible, didn't they? Very, very stable. So the Hittites and the Egyptians had come to terms over a battle that ended inconclusive. So there was actually relatively little warfare. So this period of stability you just described, that seems, it was ever reached, that seems to have been reached in the late Bronze Age. So how did these empires maintain themselves? Because maintaining military ruling over large surfaces, all this, I think this has a lot of requirements, economic requirements as well. So how did these empires maintain themselves, and how do they collect the resources they needed in order to survive?
Well, actually, for the late Bronze Age, the empire where we can study this the best is the Egyptian Empire, which was the largest in territorial terms of the period and was one of the superpower of the period. So for the entirety of the late Bronze Age, it would take a period from around 1450 BC to 1200 BC. It was really the one with the longest success in that era, in that general period. There, the Egyptian Empire was was very extensive because it expanded both to the north of Egypt and to the south of Egypt. So it penetrated into further south into Africa along the Nile River, and it penetrated into Asia, into what we call the Levant, in the areas of modern day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and so on. What we see there is actually an ability to adapt the system of control to regional circumstances. And so we see, for example, we see that they encountered different situations during their expansion in Nubia and in Syria, or in the Levant. In Syria and the Levant, actually they encounter small kingdoms called states and so on, with a pretty well-developed administrative structure. That these structures functioned independently prior to their incorporation into the Egyptian Empire. And what the Egyptians there did originally is actually just integrate these systems into their imperial system. This actually didn't seem to require that great of a logistical infrastructure. You see this, for example, in this correspondence that happens to have been preserved, fortunately for us, in the then capital city of Egypt, this town, the city called Amarna, today Akhetaten, in the past, where we see actually the correspondence between the emperor of Egypt, Akhenaten, the famous Akhenaten, and these subject rulers who are at home considered to be kings, but who are considered by the emperor of Egypt, by Akhenaten, to be his subject, his vassals. And there it is clearly a system where these local individuals, these local rulers, are held responsible for their territories and are held responsible for the collection of the resources of these territories that the Egyptians want. The Egyptians stationed very small garrisons in these cities. We know, for example, like in Jerusalem, which is one of these kingdoms, I think it's a garrison of something like only 15 Egyptian soldiers. Of course, these vassals, these rulers, know that if they do something wrong and they are within the easy reach of the Egyptian military, they will be, they will be penalized, they will be attacked, they will be deposed, and so on. And so we see there not a great deal of interference of the Egyptians in the local situation. The Egyptians also expanded simultaneously further south, where they did not encounter these types of kingdoms, these types of states. And there we see them closer to Egypt, actually integrating these territories into the Egyptian core, let us say, establishing settlements that are Egyptian settlements that are run by Egyptian administrators who may come from Egypt or who may be locals who are educated, in Egypt oftentimes to become like Egyptians. But actually we see that they are very careful in acknowledging that the local situation is not the same everywhere. So the further away from the Egyptian core, further south, actually they do interact with local leaders. And they do use them. They do use them as subject to the Egyptians working together with the Egyptians. Now, the Late Bronze Age is, the period, the Late Bronze Age, or let's say in Egyptian history, the New Kingdom period is something like 250 years, if not 300 years long. So it's a long period of time, and we do see that the Egyptians have to adapt to changing geopolitical situations. We see that especially in the Levant, where actually the Hittite Empire is their great competitor, and the Hittite Empire does similar things to the Hittite Empire, which is located in modern-day Turkey. So in its expansion to the south into Syria, it does similar things with local leaders. And there it seems that because I believe, and I think it's quite clear, that the Hittites gain territory and gain military strength in the 14th century, that actually the Egyptians withdraw more closer to Egypt itself and establish within the southern part of the Levant clear boundaries between what is Egypt and between what is outside Egypt. And so actually the great figure of Ramses II, in the famous Battle of Kadesh, 1275, I think is what people, what we usually date to. That battle, as you say, is sort of a stalemate battle. And I think afterwards, Ramses decides to sort of make the borders of Egypt clearer and actually defend the borders of Egypt more by establishing sequences of fortresses and so on.
So what you say is that this kind of indirect rule the Egyptians establish in the Levant, but also partly in Nubia, serves at reducing the cost of empire. So it's a cost-efficient way of ruling to leave the local rulers in place. So what I'm wondering, and you've mentioned the correspondence of Amarna, is this all proceeding completely smoothly in this period of 250 years we are talking about here? Or have we got news about things that don't go as the Egyptians would have liked?
Yeah. Yes, actually it is clear that so let's say in the beginning of the New Kingdom, Egypt is very successful. Actually, and it becomes very successful oftentimes through, intensive military campaigning. But then it established, let's say, after it established its control quite far north into Syria, north of modern-day Damascus, not incorporating modern-day Aleppo or so, but getting pretty close there. Once they've established themselves there, they use this system of local rulers. But these local rulers are still, let's say, actors in the whole situation, and they are aware that there are other great powers surrounding them, including the Hittites of Turkey, of Anatolia. And so we do see with the strengthening of what we call the Hittite Empire period, or the the Hittite Empire period, we see that these local rulers look at the Hittites and start saying, well, maybe we should shift our allegiance to the Hittites. And they, actually, the Amarna correspondence, which is a snapshot, perhaps only 20, at most 30-year-long snapshot in the history of Egypt's interactions with the Levant. We see within that period that certain vassals are becoming disobedient, or certain vassals are accused by other vassals of becoming disobedient. So Byblos is one of the king of Byblos is one of these, or the ruler of Byblos, who is king of Byblos to his people, but who is the subject to the Egyptians, is complaining about a kingdom slightly further north and saying that that ruler, a guy called Aziru, is becoming or is turning against the Egyptians, or is turning away from the Egyptians and allying himself with the Hittites. And actually, we do know that this was true, because one of the remarkable aspects of this period in ancient history in general, not just in ancient Near Eastern history, is that we can look at these problems not just from one point of view, the Egyptian point of view, but we can look at them also from other angles, including local angles. There are some documents, not for this particular case, there are very few that talk about this kingdom that Aziru rules, but we know from Hittite documentation about similar or about the same period or slightly later period. We know about this kingdom, which is called the Kingdom of Amuru, from another state, small state in the Levant, a place called Ugarit on the Syrian coast, and so on. So we can look at a particular issue from different perspectives, and that is very rare in the study of ancient history in general. To take an example from ancient Near Eastern history, when we talk about the Assyrian Empire, the bias of the documentation, almost all the information that we get, almost, I must say, not all the information, comes from the Assyrians themselves. Or in the Roman Empire, we know that the Roman Empire had competitors in the east, the Parthians and so on, and although there is information from Parthians, it's certainly not as abundant and as eloquent, let us say. So one of the reasons the Late Bronze Age is such an interesting period to study in the ancient Near East is because we have the ability to do so, to look at things from various perspectives. Yeah.
You've just mentioned Ugarit, this port city in the northern Levant, which gives us fascinating evidence about trade but also about the international system of the period. Ugarit is flourishing, and yet shortly after 1200 BC we see the city in ruins. So how did that come about? So how did not just Ugarit, but the whole system surrounding it, how was it possible that these empires who seemed basically invulnerable, that they collapsed one after the other in the course of very few years?
Yes, this is one of these great historical questions. Let's say the year 1200 or 1155 or whatever, to put an absolute date on it, is a moment of crisis. And so it's always, or from the very beginning of our knowledge about ancient Near Eastern history, and not just ancient Near Eastern history, but let's say the history of the Eastern Mediterranean in general, including, Greece, the area of Greece, it's clear that something really important happened, and it's the end of an era. And so to grasp how things fall apart is actually, for a historian, always very difficult, because one looks at all sorts of elements, and these particular elements to some people are very important, to other people are less important. And we see, and this is often connected to actually, things that have nothing to do, let's say, with ancient history, but are informed by general attitudes towards historical change in the period in which the investigator works. So actually, if you look at this as a historiographical problem and look at how people have looked at this in the past, I can come up with certain examples, and that will actually also clarify how difficult the question is. So one of the great sources of information on the end of this period again comes from Egypt. And Egyptian material, even already in the 19th century, when, with actually Champollion, the person who deciphered hieroglyphs, was already aware of certain accounts the Egyptians had about invasions into Egypt from the sea by the so-called sea people, who, according to late New Kingdom Egyptian sources, caused an enormous amount of disruption and havoc, not just to Egypt, which they tried to invade, but they were pushed back by several Egyptian rulers, like Merneptah, like Ramses III. But these Egyptian sources also indicated that they caused massive disruptions throughout the Levant. And they include, names of particular places that they would have destroyed, including the kingdom of the Hittites and so on. So in the 19th century, and until today, there's still adherence to this, and throughout, long periods of the 20th century, it was the common explanation of the end of this era was considered to be invaders from the outside. These invaders were called the sea peoples because the Egyptian called them people from the sea. And they actually had the Egyptians give them particular names like the Luka or the Sherden and so on. And again, partly because we have ability to look at particular regions from various sources of documentation, and because of connections you could make to first millennium BC sources, there was this idea that these actually were particular groups which we could identify, like Sherden sounded like a group of people who appear in classical sources, in Greek sources, for example, and who also sound like the name for the island of Sardinia. And so you can find still on the internet all sorts of these maps of where these people came from. They were then repulsed by the Egyptians, so where they ended up, Luca, some sort of Lycia, etc. And so the dominant explanation was a coalition of foreign forces coming from somewhere in the Mediterranean, because they come from the sea, came into the region and defeated or conquered or destroyed a whole set of these elements within the late Bronze Age system, most prominently perhaps the Hittite state, which does indeed disappear. Okay? Then archaeologists, of course, there's been a lot of excavation throughout these regions, have indeed identified certain places with destruction layers, such as Ugarit, which is totally wiped off the map around that time. And so one could easily find a whole set of other elements that fit that particular idea. I can connect this then, and this is very important for, because obviously the classical world and the Greek sources, even Roman sources, about the early history of the region, including Thucydides and so on, also mention migration, mention war, including the Trojan War that Homer talks about, and things like that could all be fitted within this particular narrative. Now, this narrative starts to be, let's say, questioned more in the post-World War II period, when actually, more critical investigation of the sources, let's say. For example, in the textual sources, it is indeed the case that the Egyptians talk about invasions from the sea people, but the remarkable thing is that they present it as if suddenly on the horizon these enemy hordes appear and the great Egyptian king pushes them back. But when you look at the various Egyptian sources, it seems like this becomes repeated over various decades, actually, accounts that are spread apart decades, accounts that are of various kings. So are there various invasions? Was there one attempted invasion and so on? Then you see that certain of the groups that seem to be included in these narratives are already present in Egyptian sources earlier on, including as mercenaries for the Egyptians. Archaeologists start to look at the destruction layers in some of the cities destroyed. The capital of the Hittites, Hattusas is the ancient name, actually became clear that, interestingly, it was abandoned. It wasn't really destroyed as a city. Actually, we see destruction of the central places, let's say the monumental places, which are then, which were already cleared out. And we don't see general destruction of the city. So people started to think, and this fits very well with, let's say, general attitudes amongst historians and not just historians. In, let's say, the 1960s, started to look at other elements. Is it actually foreign invaders who caused the disruptions? Could it have been social unrest? Could there be elements there of social struggle, elements of populations who felt, or who were, and one could say there is enough evidence for that, who were exploited by these various rural elites, that they rose up against them, against these elites, and that they turned against let's say, the symbols of elite power, including palaces and so on. Could it be a mixture of these elements, in that indeed outsiders try to come into the region at the same time as local people, perhaps in reaction to this, because this made their own lives even more difficult, then rose up against their rulers. So we can, again, if you look at Egyptian history, you see within Egyptian history this empire, this state that worked well for centuries, starts not working that well anymore. The benefits, as I mentioned in the very beginning, let's say the benefits of the peace and prosperity that the empire brought could no longer be distributed to the people. So we see actually the first evidence in world history, it's always said to be of strikes, people who go on strike against the state as their employer, because they are no longer receiving the salaries which were paid out not in cash, but which were paid out in food products and so on. They're not receiving them. So the state can no longer fulfill its obligations to its own people, and the people obviously react against it. So that was, those elements come in there as well, started to be introduced into the discussion as well. So we see actually happening today, right now in the 21st century, last decade of the 21st century, this general disintegration, let's say, the falling apart of these states could be triggered not just because of outsiders coming in, not just because of insiders being unhappy, but actually now several scholars argue that these were triggered by climate change. We all know that, that all of these parts of the world, agriculture is the basic economic infrastructure. These are agricultural states. We cannot look at them on any other way. Okay? Agricultural production obviously depends on on the availability of water. In Egypt is the Nile. In Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, it's the Tigris and the Euphrates. Northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and so on. Amounts of rainfall and so on. So there is some evidence that, for example, the levels of the Nile decreased, the level of rainfall decreased. We have some information where actually the king of the Hittites at some point writes to Egypt and asks for grain because he's running out of grain. So it's actually climate change, the deterioration of the climate that caused, actually, that triggered economic, not downfall, let us say, but a period of economic regression, lack of agricultural productivity, which could have also pushed people from outside the region into the region. The sea people are not actually presented by the Egyptians just as warriors, but also as immigrants, migrants, okay? People who try to settle in Egypt. When they are portrayed by the Egyptians, they're not just portrayed as warriors, but they bring their wives and children with them. So these are portrayed as migrants trying to enter a prosperous part of the world and being pushed back from that prosperous part of the world. And just as today, climate change has, caused people from other parts of the world to try to migrate into Europe, you can see these parallels. So there are a lot of scholars who are seeing, who presenting a narrative in that with the climate as an element in it.
Could it be that research over the years and centuries has somewhat overemphasized the downfall of the Bronze Age system and hasn't looked sufficiently at what actually maintained that system for so long? Because it's kind of taken for granted that these empires exist. But as we've seen now, they require quite a lot of things, and if one or two of these requirements are no longer given, this could push the entire system into crisis, couldn't it?
Yes, I mean, I actually like the word you're using, the system. When we look at that period, it is, what one can call an international system, even though that is an anachronistic term. But you have a period of several centuries in which various states in the region, throughout the region, have established a modus vivendi, a way of coexisting. There is competition, there is warfare, and so on. Yet, at the same time, it functions as a whole, as a system where the mere fact that there are equivalent powers in different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean is a benefit to each of these individual powers. So that the Egyptian Empire is not the sole superpower, but it is one amongst a set of equals. The Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians become part of this, and actually the terms that scholars use this like a club of great powers. They're constantly in contact with one another through diplomatic exchanges. We actually have evidence of that as well. We have treaties, we have letters that these great rulers write to each other. There's exchange of valuable products that are, high quality products indeed, but that are very important for the elites locally to assert their special position, let's say, within their own societies. And that system breaks down in the late, around 1200 again. It breaks down, perhaps because certain members of the system no longer fully, appreciate or fully, follow the rules of the system, where you have, let's say, equivalent powers. And the Battle of Kadesh, which is, of course, this emblematic, famous battle of ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian history, may actually be a sign of the breakdown of that system, because there we see two great armies fighting each other on a battlefield, two great kings fighting each other on a battlefield, which we don't really have that much previously. Actually, they fight mostly proxy wars, or they have people fighting, they try to pick off vassals from each other. They don't really clash with each other. And in Kadesh, actually, they truly clash with each other. And that, we know that after the battle, actually, Ramses patches up his relationship with the Hittites. Actually, they come to a peace treaty, a very important peace treaty that established their equality. The king of the Hittites sends his daughter to Ramses to become the primary wife of Ramses II, and so on. So, but it may be, an indication that, and this is 1275 again, that in the 13th century, this system of coexistence falls apart, and that then aggravates the other problems that one has, which include, I do believe, it did include some great deal of social tension. There are indeed outsiders who try to push their way into these states, and so on. So there is this mixture of elements that leads to an inability for these states for these empires to exist within this context, and they withdraw upon themselves. So Egypt, again, as a primary example, withdraws upon itself. The end of the New Kingdom, is in essence an Egypt that just exists within its own borders.
So you mentioned the changes this has brought about. It's probably safe to say that this is one of the major turning points even in world history. Maybe it can be compared to the fall of the Roman Empire, or maybe to the Napoleonic Wars, as far as the impact it has on people is concerned. So we started with the question, how was it like to live in an empire? So my final question would be, how was it like to live in a world where the empires were gone, and which was for several centuries kind of empire-less?
Yeah, of course, it's a good question, obviously. What happened, and this is something that ancient historians need to be very conscious about. we are at the mercy of our sources. And one thing that is certainly true for ancient Near Eastern history, and I think it's also true for Greek history, Roman history, but perhaps for, to a lesser extent, when you think about the fall of the Roman Empire, is the fact that, let's say, at 1200, around 1200, we enter what we call a dark age. Okay? Well, the Middle Ages in European history is the same. The fall of the Roman Empire leads to the Middle Ages, which were a dark age, or long perceived as a dark age as well. Okay? So our source material diminishes enormously because great states in ancient Near Eastern history are great producers of evidence for the historian, archaeological evidence as well as textual evidence. Okay? And so there is an enormous reduction of that. So take a place like Babylonia, which was part of this international system, perhaps not that well known, during the late Bronze Age, but still there's a lot of documentation. Actually, for centuries, we have barely a grasp on what is going on in that region. For many centuries, it's a truly dark age. So archaeologically, these big cities, these cities that existed, have very little evidence remaining. Textually, there's barely any textual documentation, and so on. And then, so what do we, what do we rely on in order to sort of imagine what life was like? And oftentimes we rely on later sources. And here one can, of course, make a great comparison with Greek history, or see a great parallel with Greek history. In Greece, it's the same. You have the Bronze Age Greek cultures, Mycenaean cultures, they disappear, and you have centuries of very little documentation, and then you have to, you can turn to Thucydides or something to get some idea of what happened at the time. In Babylonian sources, it is clear that the situation was very unstable, or it seems that the situation is very unstable. Later sources, and one of the difficulties whenever you work with Babylonian textual sources that are of a literary character is that it's very difficult to date when they are really composed, because one of the great things is that they come, they copy them out for centuries and centuries later on. One of the negative things is that one doesn't know what period they really are talking about and when they are really composed. But there are certain sources that seem to indicate massive disruptions. The people, cities are unsafe. We're traveling between cities is unsafe. There's a great deal of violence in the region. Newcomers again come in. Migrants are always considered throughout history as negative forces, and so on. So that's those. So if you have the sense, and actually, I think it's not wrong, because archaeology, in a way, affirms this, that life was not easy for people living in Babylonia, let's say. But for other parts of the Near East, and especially actually the parts of Syria, which seemingly in the descriptions we get of the sea people and so on, sea peoples and so on, suffered enormously. We do actually see a establishment there of new cultures, oftentimes with new elements in them, that seem to prosper quite soon after the collapse of the Bronze Age. And there are certain parts of the world that don't seem to have suffered that much, where you see a great deal of, and actually, let's say, the modern day region of Lebanon, these Phoenician cities, or become known as the Phoenician cities later on, we don't see this great deal of disruption, the same type of disruption as we see at Ugarit, for example. So perhaps it is important to look more at, because indeed large entities are disappearing or have disappeared, and to do more specific investigation of particular places, particular regions. There's an enormous variety of regions throughout the Near East, and certainly that is the case in Syria and in the Levant, and look at them individually rather than within a larger system.
So you would say how the impact was felt depends very much on where you lived and in what circumstances.
Correct. Yeah, I would think so. That is where you lived was very important. Northern Syria, it's actually remarkable how you have these places that continue. We call them the Neo-Hittites oftentimes because they continue Hittite customs and so on. Clearly, they're not Hittite as the Hittites were, but they're actually in their own consciousness of the past, considered links with the Hittites and so on. And some of these places, Karatepe is a modern name, they seem to flourish quite well. Cyprus, which is part of the Aegean world, is not going through a massive decline, if I understand correctly, actually may benefit of some of these events which we can document in archaeological terms. So even in Egypt, clearly Egypt is no longer this empire, but Egypt actually internally fragments as well. But certain when we think about Egyptian tombs, for example, we think of the tomb of Tutankhamun, which is of course absurdly rich and so on. But there are tombs from the 10th century which have an enormous amount of wealth in them as well in the north of Egypt. So where does that wealth come from? It must come from somewhere. So it's not just that everybody became destitute, far from it. But in other terms, yes, there were certain benefits of the system that existed previously that certainly did disappear in certain regions. Yeah, and I think Babylonia is one of those regions. It took a long time before, let's say, the order that I mentioned at the very beginning on, that, let's say, a common farmer could rely on and could count on, that this order was restored.
Marc, thank you very much. Next week I will be looking with Christoph Ulf at one of the regions which was particularly badly hidden, the Dark Age of Greece. Thank you very much for this interview, and I'm sure students will enjoy that.
Thank you. I'm glad we could do this in distant from each other, and I hope your students do enjoy it. I enjoy talking about it. Okay, take care.
Take care.